following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools, funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
This program was made possible through generous support from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens. Presidential Perspectives is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate and Gardens.
Presidential Perspectives, a conversation with the first 4 American presidents, is moderated by journalist Cokie Roberts.
This is a great treat for me. When I told my journalistic colleagues that I was going to be interviewing Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, they were very jealous because that is an opportunity no one else has ever had. But I wanted to start, of course, with the first president, General Washington, because you really, in some ways, had the biggest challenge of all, the challenge of actually starting a government. And I wanted to talk to you about that. And then I noticed that we had a question from the students at Ms. Barnes' class in Silverton High School in Silverton, Oregon. You might not know about it. I was just about to say, you might not know about Oregon, but it is a state now.
Beyond the Ohio?
Well beyond the Ohio, and actually all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And I know it is quite remarkable to think about that, but President Jefferson would have liked it if he had known about it. But the fact is that...
Had the general known about Oregon? Yes, had he known about it, we might have been able to achieve it earlier than we were able to.
But there was nothing. There was no Congress, there was no judiciary, there was no money, there was no place of government. It was a challenge.
Madam, what there was the will and the resolve of the people. We had just been victorious years earlier in a great contest. We were transitioning to a new type of government. There were many people that did not know what to make of this transition, and you can understand it. The entire rest of the world, at the time that we declare our American independence and again ratify our Constitution, the entire rest of the world is under the control of kings and queens and lords and ladies and people of ultimate power. And we constrain ourselves through our Constitution to a democratic republic, a small d and a small r. And it was, as I had writ back then, a path that was untrodden. I was frightened, if truth be told. You know, to establish the government is one thing. To make it happen and execute is another. And so I found myself faced with the establishment of major departments, the establishment of counselors from those departments, the heads of the great departments, I called them, dealing with Congress, which of course was always particularly interesting. Oh, you laugh, but I will tell you, the very first time I appeared before Congress, we had just completed a negotiation of a treaty with the Creek Indians down in Georgia. And I had to seek the advice and consent of the Congress. It didn't say how to do it in the Constitution. You report firsthand, or do you send a report? I decided to meet in front of them.
Did you decide, General, to meet in front of them because you knew that your very presence often intimidated other men?
Well, Madam, I'm quite certain that is not the case. I thought that it was the appropriate manner to seek their advice and consent directly. To cut to the end of the chase, my recollection is that they argued and argued and argued and argued. Congress is made up mostly of lawyers. They are always arguing about something. And I remember saying to my aide, Colonel David Humphreys, that I am damned if I will ever set foot in that Congress again.
President Jefferson, you didn't like setting foot in Congress either. In fact, you stopped delivering the State of the Union message in person.
Well, I did, yes. I was always and continue to be uncomfortable in large bodies. Not so much because I am uncomfortable in the midst of my fellow man and my people, but no, simply uncomfortable that whatever I may say may not be heard then exactly as I would desire it to be received. So as a consequence, I would always read my speeches before Congress and therefore get it precisely correct as I intended, and no matter what someone might hear or desire to hear for themselves, I'd then turn it directly to the newspapers so they might print it distinctly as I wrote it. So you're absolutely right that I preferred, rather than appearing before Congress, to send my State of the Union messages there.
There's now an invention. I know that you're interested in inventions. There's an invention that allows you to read your speech while looking at the people. It's called a teleprompter. Our current president is very fond of it. President Adams, the Judiciary was still very much in its infancy as you became president, and you appointed as Chief Justice someone who really set the tone for decades to come, and much to the dismay of your successor to your right.
Many things I did were to the dismay of my successor to my right. Perhaps you should be sitting on the other side. Yes, the role of the Supreme Court as the ultimate decider and adjudicator of issues betwixt not only individuals, but individuals and government, as it has evolved, is, I think, in a sense, a mirror of the judiciary as it existed before the Revolution, where our system of justice was not so much based upon statute law, but on the common law, which involved both statute and custom. Both might be used if reasonable, and neither used if unreasonable. Rule of law was not intended to mean anything other than rule of reason, and that the magistrates in your county could decide to not take cognizance of a particular code or statute if its application led to an injustice. The Supreme Court, as I think was originally intended, provided the means by which the federal government would act in a like manner. And I'm sorry that Mr. Jefferson was discouraged and upset with some of their decisions, as am I, but that's not to the point of it. I think the Supreme Court, the way it has evolved, is ingenious. I wish the Constitution made a clearer distinction between our courts and the legislature.
President Madison, speaking of original intent, you were there. These two gentlemen were abroad when the Constitutional Convention took place. And you and General Washington, you had a tremendous influence on everything that was in that document. What did you mean for the Supreme Court?
Well, the Constitution, as it certainly evolved, is the work of many heads and many hands, and hardly can be attributed to the effort of any single individual.
Even one referred to as the father of the Constitution?
Well, one cannot control the accolades others would bestow upon themselves. I follow my wife on many instances and find she precedes me in such matters, so I will not be surprised if she's called the mother of the Constitution. There are many issues about the Supreme Court, but there's an overriding concern, I believe, amongst those members that elements of jurisprudence were so disseminated amongst the states and so much an influence amongst each of the states, the sovereignty of the states being so well guarded by each of the states, that to introduce a new national government, and thus also what naturally follows a Supreme Court, is to raise the issues of where elements of jurisdiction would take place, where the distinction between state law might take precedence or be subservient to national law. And so in writing the Constitution, it was left to the first Congress to render a Judiciary Act that would form the structure of the judiciary. And from that, the collective wisdom of members of Congress then might determine what the structure might be. And as a result, actually, each of the members of the 5 members of the Supreme Court was to take a different district rather than to meet in concert with one another. And many decisions that arose within their various districts then came to the attention of each Supreme Court justice rather than the collective body, as was the case with Mr. Marshall.
Mr. Jefferson is nodding agreement there. Of course, Mr. Marshall was your cousin in addition to being the Chief Justice, and that there didn't seem to be a lot of family fealty in that relationship.
Well, of course, Virginia is a vast network of cousinry, is it not? And we all remain quite divided in our political opinions, as it should be. After all, that is family, is it not? No, I have adhered to the wisdom of the mighty Madison. I think he's the most luminous mind I've ever known, and he particularly has explained and made clear what our president, John Adams, has said, and that is we have adopted and we have utilized the purity of English common law, which is a law that is, well, it emanates from the people themselves. It is the result of the experience of the people, and therefore it grows with the people. That body in our government, elected directly by the people themselves, is the legislative body, and therefore they are ultimately responsible for the creation of the laws of our nation. After all, sir, a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions must grow as we grow as a people.
I may add, as a matter of a challenge that each of the presidents has, when the government was first formed and the nature of judiciary established at the national level, and notwithstanding the controversies that might arise amongst the several state jurisdictions, one of the elements that seemed to confront us was whether American jurisprudence would stand singular and be original to the American matters of jurisprudence, or whether we should rest heavily upon the British example that preceded our own independence. And the nature of common law already addressed seemed to inculcate in many of the people British practices of law.
I think that, now that we've been here, I know this is difficult to really think about, but we've been working at it now. I know, I hate to say this to you, but for a couple of 100 years. And so I think we're not going to debate this any longer tonight. Let us move on.
I agree, madam. What I heard was, well, it was 3 lawyers.
General, I'm curious. I know that while you were commanding the Army, that you found that there were problems with the decentralized federal government. But Virginia was such a strong force. And the states, when you referred to my country, you meant Virginia.
Correct.
What made it so that you felt comfortable coming into this much more central government?
Well, that is a bit of a transition in and of itself, madam. I was a loyal subject of the king. I served king and country in the French and Indian War. It's what caught Mr. Adams' attention and why he nominated me, in essence, to be commander-in-chief.
Well, it might have also caught his attention that you arrived wearing your militia jacket.
I did, madam. I did so because I wanted to show my strong support of a military response to the British aggression.
And also he was not from New England.
And if truth be told, I wanted to be named a senior officer. In my mind, I wanted to be the commander-in-chief of all the forces of Virginia, not the commander-in-chief. I never saw myself particularly as a military genius.
Does any of you really think that's correct? You were there. You were at the Continental Congress. Do you think that he expected to be the commander-in-chief?
I am in no position now, nor will I ever be, to refute anything General Washington says.
Madam, I can assure you that I enlisted the assistance of fellow Virginians to try to block the nomination.
General, I think the Virginians really did know what they heard. You were there. You're a Virginian.
Yes, I was there. I had already begun to collaborate with Mr. Adams, and I will never forget and can readily remember it was near unanimous that Colonel Washington be appointed the commander-in-chief. In fact, to receive the rank of general, the very first general to be commissioned by a representative body of the people themselves. Remember, we were denied the rank of general in the colonies of Great Britain. We could never possibly achieve that rank. We could only be appointed colonels and receive the same. So this was an extraordinary achievement on behalf of something purely American in our interest.
Thomas, you have me spinning back because I remember when I was commissioned, I thought that it was the oddest military commission in history. I was commander-in-chief of an army of one.
Right.
There were no other officers. There were no other enlisted men at that time.
Well, the Army of New England laying siege to Boston was, of course, at that time adopted by Congress to be the Continental Army.
But they were militia up to that point.
And geniuses started joining you very quickly. People like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox came quickly to your camp.
It was a remarkable confluence of great talent, and let us not forget others as well, Colonel Arnold and
Who ended badly.
that is the story for another day, but you are correct.
Partly because of Miss Shippen. But President Jefferson, you talked about Americans couldn't even become general. It's not one of the grievances you listed in the Declaration of Independence, but there were many others. And as you say, you and Mr. Adams were already collaborating at that point. Why did it take you so long? Mr. Adams, I've read your wife's mail. And she was very, very angry that you were just, as she felt, you were just nowhere near staunch enough against the British, and that you should have declared independence considerably before you did.
How have you come to read my wife's mail?
It was intercepted.
No, had it not been for Mrs. Adams, there would have been no Mr. Adams of note, and not just supporting me in independence. I had to, Congress could not agree on anything. Everyone was a great man. I mean, if there was so much as a resolution that 2 + 3 = 5, we would have debated upon it for the next 3 or 4 days before it was finally accepted. It was astounding what it was to get anything through Congress. Everything was debated. Everything was debated inside and out. You would look at one particular issue, I don't know how many different ways, and now here we are proposing that we commit treason. For treason it is if we fail. In the history of the world, no colony had ever broken away from the parent state without the parent state's acceptance or acknowledgement of it. The fact that Mrs. Adams was so adamant for independence and so much in support of not only my endeavors, but the endeavors of Mr. Jefferson and others. Indeed, it was proposed by a Virginian, Mr. Lee, the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, the convention having adopted it. But this is only I cannot begin to express you the support of my dearest friend, my Abigail, not only in moving for independence, but in traveling to Europe with her 10-year-old son in the winter time, with the possibility of being taken by British frigates at any time, if not destroyed by the very oceans themselves.
You traveled to Europe.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And she, indeed, we discussed her coming to France as well, but because of the dangers and the fact that someone needed to maintain our homestead in Braintree, in Massachusetts.
To keep the family going.
Absolutely. And the sacrifices she made and the fear she faced daily, it certainly rivals
I did think
the
it was
anguish
somewhat
of any
rude
soldier.
of you at one point, though, to write to her from Philadelphia that if it got truly dangerous, she should take the children and fly to the woods. And then you went out to dinner.
How many letters have you read?
You know, Madam, to your original question, if I may bring it back full circle.
I told her to burn those.
Thomas was speaking about collaboration. It is critically important to your understanding of your history that you are clear about the fact that when we did come together in Philadelphia City for the initial Congress and then subsequently 6 months later, we were citizens of 13 separate countries. We were absolute strangers to each other at that first Continental Congress. We had separate economies, separate armies. 9 of the colonies had standing navies. Complete and utter distrust. And so it is remarkable when we came together.
Well, I'm sorry to tell you that it's still very difficult to get something through Congress without a lot of argument. Mr. Madison, you are the only one of these presidents who served in the United States Congress. And you almost didn't get elected. You know, the people now today have something that they talk about gerrymandering and drawing districts, but and talk of redistricting. But the very first districting, you had a governor who tried to draw a district that cut you out, drawn like a hand. The fingers were all to elect Mr. Monroe.
The effort of Mr. Henry was to choose 8 counties in Virginia, the most of whom had voted against the Constitution during the Virginia ratifying convention. And by so assembling that element of counties together, he could be ensured that they would not be voting me to be in the House of Representatives. He first contrived to have my name third on the list of 2 that were chosen as senators. And then he also chose Mr. Monroe, a very good friend of mine, to compete against that seat. Mr. Monroe was accepting of that post, but he and I had no animosity with one another. Mr. Henry also chose to have the election at a time when it was a very, very bad storm. He also delineated in the legislature that the representative had to be living in the district from which he was to be chosen. And the only restrictions on the part of the federal Constitution that I only needed to live in the state in which I was given, which I was born. And there was even an offer in the southeastern part of Virginia to have me run in that district to ensure my election to the Congress, but I refused to do it because of the difficulties that might ensue once the Congress is formed and challenges to my holding the
But
seat.
because these areas were so anti-Constitution, you found yourself making a campaign promise for a Bill of Rights.
Well, there were certain elements without Virginia as well as within Virginia that were objecting to the Constitution, much to my surprise, for its lack of a Bill of Rights. I do not wish to get into a lengthy discussion of it, but essentially a Bill of Rights is to protect the people against the most contrary of governments. The most contrary of governments at the time were the state governments that had plenary powers rather than national government that had limited powers. The dangers would more readily come from the states than from the national government.
Mr. Jefferson, I see you nodding away there. You would not have been happy without that Bill of Rights.
No, I certainly would not have been, and the very suggestion that Mr. Madison took upon the concern allied himself then with the general interest of Colonel Henry. Patrick Henry's greatest concern was that he did not trust the federal government, that it should be anchored with a Bill of Rights, securing these rights unto the people that ought to be protected by the government. And it is the very same concern that I held 3,000 miles away across the ocean in France when I read that delightful manuscript of our draft of the Constitution and wrote back that I am captivated by this, the shortest document of its kind, creating a government to check its own power, vesting the greater influence within the 3 branches in the legislative branch, and with a prologue stating, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," thereby recognizing that our government is not perfect. We continue to strive to make for a more perfect union, and yet I wrote that it lacks something. It lacks something most vital to preserve, protect, and defend the inherent rights of the people, and that I pronounced as a Bill of Rights, which all people upon the globe are entitled to, against any government.
Now you felt, yes,
I'm so sorry, Ms. Roberts.
Mr. Adams, I was
I
just coming to you, that you felt that the key piece of legislation in Mr. Adams' administration was against the First Amendment to that Bill of Rights.
You are referring, of course, to one key legislation being the Sedition Act and the other to be the Alien Act, and you're absolutely correct.
And President Adams, we have a question from Miss Revere's class in Frontier Regional School in Deerfield, Massachusetts, your home state. And the class wants to know why you supported those acts, the Alien Act and the Sedition Acts.
Well, as Jefferson said earlier, our republic is evolving and that the laws are passed by the legislature, and it is the legislature that passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. And they were supported by me. I did not propose them, but I did support the principle of it, and that in the name of a free press, for God's sakes, Jefferson. I do not advocate a press that is controlled by the government any more than I advocate a press that is controlled by an individual for his own gain, his own agenda. Let us refer back to the election of 1800. How many newspapers did you purchase? The perception in 1800. Now think on this, think on this. I'm the son of a farmer and a shoemaker. His father before him was a farmer. I was raised knowing the joy of toiling with my own two hands. And yet, because of the newspapers in the election of 1800 owned by Mr. Jefferson, the perception is that I was a monarchist, while Jefferson, living atop his mountain, enjoying an opulence many Americans cannot even imagine, provided by bondsmen and bondswomen held in the most cruel slavery, is recognized as a friend of the working man.
Your wife referred to it as the scurrility of the press.
Oh, you read that letter too, did you? The Alien and Sedition Act was not to shut down newspapers that were opposed to the government, but newspapers which lied. Sir, lied. They were to be held accountable. Certainly you do not object to that.
General Washington, some of those newspapers even went after you, which was highly unusual. And Mr. Jefferson, though he was your Secretary of State, became critical of you.
Madam, I do not know if this will ring true to our guests here this day, but I can assure you that politics in our day and time is a blood sport, and that the best response to any form of calumny is to just ignore it. I will also tell you that, gentlemen, it is the spirit of mutual concession that allows us to move forward, and I would ask you to keep that in mind as well, John.
Did you actually? One of our classes wants to know, Mr. Jefferson. This is from Miss Tullis's class in Brandon High School in Brandon, Mississippi. She says, "Did your opinions change about President Washington once you became president?"
I would say that as His Excellency, without his present knowledge, shed his mortal coil the last month of the last year, the last century, that when I was thereby elected the third Chief Magistrate of our nation, but within the next 2 years, that there was a sense of great honor and great reverence for our first Chief Magistrate of this nation. And I certainly stood to recognize that, protect, and defend it, yes. I began to realize the great difficulty that he had in presiding over our new nation, to be the first to hold that office of Chief Magistrate, the great burden that was on his shoulders, to sail forth this ship of state, and as you have recognized so well, the very first nation founded upon the principles of self-government, not upon principles of monarchy, nor upon principles of aristocracy. I realized what a most noble effort and most noble achievement you made in that first administration. Yes, we disagreed, ma'am. We disagreed, and I made that apparent to him, and if I did not, he would read it in the newspapers. But we realized as Americans that we can agree to disagree, and yet, as you have just said, sir, to always remember we must move forward through compromise and resolution for the common good, and to recognize that as Americans, a difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. So I began to hold a great regard for the general in that memory.
Your criticism, however, did not sit well with Mrs. Washington, who did feel that you were somewhat despicable, I think was her word.
She read her mail too.
No, I lament what I have heard of Mrs. Washington's opinion of me. I think those opinions were formed, of course, during her husband's, the latter part of his first administration, when I ventured here to Mount Vernon to suggest that the maintenance of our union, that the North and the South might continue to hang together, relied upon the general seeking a second term as our president. I know that Mrs. Washington was not in favor to have her husband any the longer removed from his domestic felicity here. And I think that is what annoyed her. I have tried to make my way here to the Mansion House to attend to
I
his
I would urge you to forego that visit.
I heard her say, or it is told me, that when she was engaged in a discussion with a news writer, and he mentioned to her that indeed the passing of her husband might be the most disastrous day in her life, one which she should never care to look back on with any sense of happiness, she replied, no, there were two of the same in my life. The other was when Thomas Jefferson came to visit.
Mr. Madison, you had the experience of following President Jefferson. Here he was a man of stature. He had written the Declaration of Independence with some help. He had purchased Louisiana, which was very popular in the country. And then you came in. And it was not an easy time for you. Everybody was getting very unhappy. The Embargo Act was liked by no one. The president who had been for it had disappeared back to Monticello, as he was wont to do. It must have been a challenge to be following in those footsteps.
I had the good fortune to spend 8 years as the Secretary of State for Mr. Jefferson's administration. And in that position, I was not very far from the circumstances that addressed his administrations, and found them somewhat similar as I entered the presidency. We've had difficulties with the French and the English. In fact, most of the domestic strife that seemed to persist in our country was a direct outgrowth of circumstances that were taking place in Europe. Those divided in America were either very pro-British or very pro-French. And as a consequence, those affairs in Europe began to take on domestic import in the United States. And in entering the presidency, in fact, I like to think that at least at first I had some reprieve when the British had sent an ambassador to the United States, known as Copenhagen Jackson. And I met with him for 3 days and then dismissed him, saying to the British that we would no longer accept such an ambassador that they had sent in Copenhagen Jackson. And these matters, when I entered my administration, there was a surplus of nearly $850,000. When Mr. Jefferson entered into his administration, there was a deficit, I believe, of near $90 million.
$90 million. Can you imagine suffering a deficit of our nation, $90 million in arrears?
And Mr. Jefferson and I both enjoyed the company of Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was able to alter those figures considerably in a most open and very favorable fashion.
You know, Mr. Jefferson, speaking of Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin, when you came in, you fired so many Federalists from the government that he was having a hard time filling the positions in his department. And he suggested to you that perhaps it would be wise to hire some women for those positions. And you said that that was something that the country was not ready for, nor were you.
Your next question. To each their own opinion, if you will. I have never denied a lady to attend to her interest as she would desire, and yet I wonder, I am curious why a lady would ever want to dirty her delicate digits with an attention to politics. It's an onerous duty, and I think she is much happier, would you not agree, General, in her domestic pursuits?
Why anyone would of the fair sex would want to become involved in political appointment, the worst kind of public service, I think.
Well, gentlemen,
well,
I
Mr.
must
Adams,
take issue.
yes, and Mr. Madison, each of your wives were very political women. In fact, Mr. Madison, your opponent in 1808, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, said, I ran against Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I would have had a better chance against Mr. Madison alone.
It is one matter in which Mr. Pinckney and I would most readily agree. In the matter of politics, my wife was always an astute and always has been very astute and very perspicacious, certainly, in reviewing political matters and giving and offering opinions to me, which have been very beneficial. But she has also been quite engaged in offering appointments to individuals and assisting individuals in the government. I believe Martha Washington at one point, I hope this is not indelicate to bring before you, but your own daughter had mentioned at one point a cousin that wished to become a position. I believe the post was given to Mr. Johnson, to the postmaster, I believe, in New Orleans.
Well,
I beg your pardon, you mean Martha Randolph?
Oh, Martha
Martha
Randolph, excuse me.
yes.
Martha.
Yes,
But
I
in
was-
fact, Mr. Adams' wife also appealed to your wife for a position for her son-in-law.
Yes. My wife dealt with many of these issues, and only perhaps in passing in conversation at dinner was I made aware of the events after they had taken place.
Mr. Adams, Mr. Madison was talking about problems with the French and the English, and when you were president, there was a lot of movement toward going to war with the French. And in fact, your wife was on that team of going to war with the French. You worked hard to avert that war. Did you ever get credit for that?
I didn't do it for the credit. It was the greatest achievement I think I obtained during my presidency was keeping the peace. That was one of the reasons for the Alien and Sedition Acts, was to keep various agencies within the country from fanning the flames of war. We were treated with nothing but contempt by revolutionary France. Indeed, they were seizing our ships upon the high seas, as the British were wont to do. A little while later, no declaration of war, of course, but of course we did arm ships, and we sent ships to sea with the orders to defend themselves against the French and to protect American merchantmen. And I'm proud to say that I played an instrumental role in the founding of the United States Navy, which Mr. Jefferson used to good effect when he had opportunity to do so, even though at the time he was much against it.
Did your experience being in France, and this is a question from Ms. Smith's class in Paxton Center School in Paxton, Massachusetts, again from your home state, did your experience as a diplomat, first in France and then in England, help when you were trying to deal with the French?
In a sense, it helped because while I was a diplomat in France, I learned not to trust the members of the French government, but I was greatly pleased with the people, with the humanity that I encountered. And speaking of women, they were largely very educated and very much involved with what was going on, regardless of their status.
You did write home about that. It was not a well-received letter.
That's true. And although I admonished Abigail not to be jealous, Abigail in her own right, of course, is very, very much educated, although not in college. But she certainly has more wisdom and knowledge regarding poets than I have. Not much more, but some. But to that degree, yes. I wanted peace with France. I wanted peace with England. England is our mother country. Our Constitution is inspired by the British Constitution in more codified form, obviously.
Mr. Jefferson, you look like you're having trouble holding your tongue. There's no need.
Well, no, I'd wish only to say that I condone President Adams' actions in keeping us out of war. I was very much concerned that we might find ourselves at war with our former ally. And yes, while I certainly was not in favor of the French attacking our merchant vessels, suppressing our sailors to serve in their navy, I was very much appreciative of your efforts to keep us out of war. However, I do not believe that the Alien and Sedition laws bore any effect upon it whatsoever. In fact, Mr. Adams, you're wont to state that those laws were not passed by you. I agree. They were passed by the Congress indeed, a Federalist Congress, predominantly Federalist Congress. You did have the opportunity of veto, but you encouraged the elements of
Sir, the first political party was the Republican Party, started by you because of your objections to those people who supported the Constitution.
Gentlemen, may I remind you that we have guests?
General Washington, you didn't expect parties.
Madam, I believe that political parties are by their nature inevitable. You asked earlier about the formation of the government. It was from within my council of the departments of the heads of the great departments that I believe these factions began to form. And I very simply believe that Political factions, divisions, and party do not bode well for this country. I believe by their very nature they tend to elevate one individual above all others, and that the party supports that individual at the cost of the common good. And if truth be told, I believe that politicians by their nature tend to twistify the very engine that puts them into office. And they take care of themselves first, their friends second, and the common welfare a very distant third. This does not speak well for our nation, nor does it bode well for the future.
But of course there were parties by the end of your first administration, and by the time Mr. Adams ran for president, after you had decided to step down after 2 terms, he was the head of one party and Mr. Jefferson the head of another. And I now have a question here from Ms. McLean's class at St. Charles School in Virginia. And I think I'll turn it to Mr. Adams. What was your relationship with your vice president? Do you think the vice president should have more responsibility? Because, of course, you were the last president, the first and the last, to have a vice president of a different party.
That would depend upon the vice president as to whether or not he should have more responsibility. The role of the vice president is to take over the reins of government should anything befall the president, and to act as president of the Senate, which, of course, Jefferson did when he was in town.
I will admit that I spent most of my time at Monticello in a good read. I've always said the mind of man never conjured up a more useless office than that of the vice presidency.
Of course, your vice president presided over the Senate, over an impeachment trial in the Senate while he was under indictment for murder.
Well, yes, but only for a few months. He did not seek the office of vice president in the presidential election of 1804, nor was he invited to do so. But you are correct. And my vice president, I may say, was by the very same default in our Constitution, which is written, whoever receives the second highest number of votes automatically becomes the vice president. And thereby, yes, the one who has contended is now expected to ally with the victor, which is an Your Excellency, it is an impossibility in human nature for that to occur. And therefore, as you said earlier, yes, a difference of opinion is to be expected and, in my opinion, to be encouraged. That is what provides the energy of our nation, particularly the reconciliation of differences of opinion.
And as you have said many times, Thomas, it befits this country and it benefits the people of this country if we keep in mind the spirit of 70 and 6.
Oh, that's correct.
Thank God you can rationalize anything.
Mr. Adams, you've talked about keeping us out of war with France and about establishing the Navy. We have a question from Ms. McLaren's class at Claremore High School in Claremore, Oklahoma, a state. Yes, former Indian territory. But
Well, where else is it coming from?
Mr. Madison, I think I'll turn it to you. What do you think was your greatest contribution to establishing the security or the posterity of the United States?
It has to be the invocation of the Constitution. When the defects of the Confederation under the Articles of Confederation were made apparent, it did carry us through a long and arduous war through the devices of many and most trying circumstances, I may add. But when the war was concluded, and it was obvious that the Articles of Confederation would not meet the needs of the collective states or each individual states, the introduction of a Constitution became very, very critical. But it was not just the Constitution. It was the invocation and construction of Republican government, both at the national level and at the state level, that became very critical. The Constitution is a reflection of that presumption and that assumption of what a Republican government can and should be. There were no precedents to address these issues of what a Republican government should be. We had a frail understanding of human behavior. The matter of factions turning into parties, there was a suggestion I very clearly felt that with a diverse republic, many factions would arise, organizing themselves according to the particular issue. And as each new issue introduced, it would form an entirely different construction of a faction. And these would persist through each successive issue with the Congress, and thus perhaps come to some reasonable conclusion to the issues that face the nation. The introduction of the Constitution seems to be the most important structural contribution, not only for our own generation, but for successive generations.
Mr. Jefferson, you apparently were puzzled when you read the Constitution about the Senate. Why should we have a Senate, you asked?
Well, and yet not denying that there ought to be some element in our government that is consistent, that remembers where we have been in order to know better where we are and where we are going. I did question that a Senate should be one, say, appointed by state legislatures. Might it not be a body that is elected directly by the people themselves? At the same time, I realized that it maintains a stability in this new nation, a balance, if you will, of the smaller states with the larger states to be represented with 2 senators. But I certainly had that question of appointment and of election of the body, but never questioning the stability that it could provide.
Now, when you talk about elected by the people, General Washington, when you're talking about election by the people, you're talking about white men over the age of 21 who own property?
Correct.
Or pay taxes.
But there are no other people that you would think should vote.
Well, madam, you know, it is interesting. You are suggesting something in your question.
I'm asking a question.
She works for a newspaper.
May I return the question? Who do you have in mind, ladies?
I have in mind ladies, I have non-property owners, non-taxpayers, people of color.
You know, my dear, I would suggest to you that this is an evolving republic. I would suggest to you, without any form of apology, that we remember the words that Thomas uttered not 30 minutes earlier, that a boy of 14, or a man of 50 cannot wear the same clothing as a boy of 14. And I would imagine that this document, our Constitution, which forms the basis of the laws of this nation, it is an imperfect document. But make no mistake about it, an imperfect something is better than a perfect nothing. And so I can imagine that as this country evolves, ladies will receive the vote and others as well. You know that New Jersey granted women the vote, and they took it away from them.
And free blacks. Women and free blacks had the vote in New Jersey.
And in North Carolina, blacks vote.
And of course, they took it away from them.
But if I may, General, forgive me for interrupting.
By all means.
The tradition of voting, prior to the Revolution, the only office that one voted for was your representative in the tax levying assembly. To maintain, the notion of taxation is the right of the taxpayer. Taxpayers tax themselves through their elected representatives. Since the Revolution, we seem to be inclined to elect everyone, and this is definitely an aspect of the Constitution which needs to be addressed. As far as women participating in government, gentlemen, while we were British subjects, we had several female heads of state.
It may also be reflected that in the respective states where the decision of who will hold the franchise, the suffrage, is determined, that the people at large make their sentiments known to the representatives that they choose, that those engaged in the political process have a stake in the outcome of the political process, and that as the general familiarity with matters and the concern and the applicability of laws becomes more general, we may see an alteration in the state governments in the manner of the franchise. Each different kind of election elicits a different response from the states as who is qualified and who is not qualified to vote. In the general conventions for the ratifying of the Constitution, there was a very general application of the use of suffrage. for individuals, whereas in the election, perhaps, of the representatives from each district, it was more constricted.
And think not that women don't vote. They do. They may not be publicly polled, but in the home, they most certainly do vote.
There have been some suggest that to give women the vote would only double the influence they already exert on political outcomes.
We are not the masters. That is an illusion.
These are the kinds of jokes that women in your time and mine do not appreciate.
This is not a joke.
President Jefferson, the other group of people in the Constitution were not treated as whole human beings, were the men and women in bondage. And do you, from your perspective in the early 19th century, think that that is an issue that America can work out peacefully?
I am hopeful that it may be worked out peaceably. I would like to remain dedicated to that hope rather than to find myself in any despair. It has been my lifelong effort to see an eradication of this barbarous commerce between slave and master. It is pure despotism, and who should know better than one who owned slaves in my very first public office in Williamsburg, Virginia, there in the old House of Burgesses. My first action was to stand in that body and call for permission to begin to end the importation of slaves, merely asking for the permission to do so, and I was immediately trounced, asked to be seated, provoking a consternation amongst the delegates. Who is this upstart from the wilderness? Who is this turncoat to his class? How well we understand the purity of English law, the common law, that which we have adopted, is vested 9/10, is it not, in the protection of person and property. That is the conundrum we face now and for our future. How do we extricate ourselves from the property of our fellow man, bound for life as a unit thereof? I believe that it is possible. It will not happen overnight, and progress is always at a snail's pace. But I believe we have made it progress over the years. We have followed the devices of our Constitution, allowing our Congress to vote to end the importation of slaves. That was there from the very first reconciliation, 1808. It has been followed through, but now we have the opportunity to provide a new empire of liberty there west of the Mississippi River. Not allow these goods and chattels and human bondage to be taken to the left bank of the Mississippi River. I am hopeful that that might be fulfilled. Otherwise, if we are to draw lines westwards, deciding that the territory should enter our union as either slave or free state, then it will become a fire bell in the night, and all I fear will not see that speck on our horizon which will fall upon us as a great tornado.
Mr. Adams, this was an institution that you felt was evil from the beginning.
Well, certainly. And it is inevitable that those that are kept in this cruel slavery will ultimately be freed. I was just thinking as you were speaking about our earlier conversation about women. English common law, men and women have the same rights. No one having the right to vote, no one having the right to participate in government. Those are privileges, except the monarch. We've had kings, we've had queens. That is the only office in government one enters by right. As a republic, we maintain that the right applies to all. So inevitably, women will certainly be having a full voice in government, as will those people who are now enslaved. It is inevitable. We will not likely see it, but it is most certainly inevitable.
Mr. Madison, this was a constitution that you, as much as anybody else, crafted. And do you see, looking to the future, do you see the nation holding together over when this crucial issue comes before it?
I believe every generation will suffer crises and issues that they are seemingly unable to address. The Constitution and the government formed under the Constitution at least provides the means by which they have some hopes of resolving the issues that are extant amongst them. In this respect, the Constitution may be perhaps the shortest document, as Mr. Jefferson has suggested. It's been followed by Poland in 1790 and a few other nations since that time. We were concerned with establishing a republican form of government, not resolving political issues during that convention. And I believe the government that was formed, however hazardous, and there were so many instances at which each step the whole enterprise could have fallen apart. That the fact that the Constitution was ratified by the several states and has been engaged for at least 20 years now, in my experience, I have every hope that it will continue because it is not so constricted. When amendments may be proposed, it will constrict the structure of the government. We may have more problems than we wish to address.
Mr. Washington, General Washington, can you look forward and imagine that Constitution that you presided over, that convention, that hot September in Philadelphia? How long do you think that Constitution might last?
I spoke a short moment ago, Madam, about the evolution in a process, how it moves forward. I believe that as long as the document remains, well, I don't want to spark an entire debate about implied powers versus strict interpretation.
From us?
But as long as the document can bend in the way a willow does in a great storm, this union will stand. If we imagine ourselves as an oak tree, and you will forgive me, I am a farmer, the oak tree will topple because it is rigid. The willow will live on through all of the problems that it faces. I see the union that way, and to Jemmy's comment with regard to slavery, with regard to other problems that we have, it is the union that we are talking about, madam. It is this nation, out of many, one, that we, at the end of every day, thank divine providence for. And without union, madam, we have nothing. I can assure you that.
Well, that is a hopeful thought, General Washington, for us to take into the present and into the future. And you mentioned that you are a farmer, and we are here on your farm. So I think that we all would like to say thank you for your hospitality. Mrs. Washington is not with us, which is probably a good thing for President Jefferson.
Well, she is up
at the house. Yes.
And you're most welcome to visit with her. She would be most pleased to see all of you. We cannot put you all up for the night, I'm afraid.
Although you've come close.
Madam, the year after the presidency, we had 677 overnight guests by my accounting.
Which is why I always refer to it as Martha and George Washington's Mount Vernon. Thank you so very much, President Washington.
My honor.
President Adams, President Jefferson, President Madison.
Thank you.
It's been a delight to be with you tonight.
And thank you, madam.
Thank you
very
much.
Thank you indeed.